Well, we're missing a couple here, but we'll go on and get started. We're going to spend a little bit of time this morning beginning on chapter 2 and try to that this chapter is called the Principles of Pest Control. And as we begin to talk about controlling a pest from any sort of mechanism, you've got to be able to identify what your pest is. You can't attempt to control something if you don't know what it is. So that's one of the things we'll talk about with this. We're going to identify what the 5 most common pests are, and talk about the different pest management options that exist as we move through the idea of pest control. And we're going to talk about what's meant by the term prevention. We're going to talk about what's meant by suppression, and then eradication. Those are different approaches to pest control. And we want to look at what's meant by thresholds and how they are used in developing a pest management strategy. We're going to look at evaluating pest management strategy and describe the principles that are involved in what we call integrated pest management, or IPM. That's a buzzword, or a very popular approach to a more ecologically accepted method of pest management than what I grew up with. Growing up on a farm that we grew apples, we had a philosophy that we didn't tolerate any pests, or didn't tolerate any diseases. So we had a philosophy of not managing them. We wanted to kill them. If we had a particular insect or disease situation, we didn't evaluate how much we had the potential for it. We used an application of something to try to eradicate it. But IPM takes a different approach, and we're going to talk about that. And IPM is used in most all types of chemical application today. It's not a shoot them and kill them all type philosophy, and we'll spend a little time talking about that and try to create an awareness with you guys of what an IPM, or an integrated pest management approach is. So we're going to talk a little bit about the factors that cause a pesticide application to fail, and what that might be and how you would deal with those. And we're going to also talk a little bit about pesticide resistance and how you can potentially deal with a resistance problem. So, but as we do that, we've always got some definitions, so we'll know what we are talking about as we begin to move through this particular chapter. And most of these are terms that you guys have been exposed to and familiar with. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them, but I'm going to make sure that you all have an understanding of them. And some of them can be a little bit confusing, but they are definitions that if you've had the plant science class, you've had the first 2 or 3 we're going to talk about. If you haven't had that class, you may have had it in the biology class or something like earlier. But an annual, I'm talking about a plant primarily with this. So what would be a something that you would list as an annual plant? Anybody? What's the term annual mean?
Every year.
Every year, right. So an annual, when we talk about, the plant world, we're talking about plant that completes its life cycle in 1 year. You plant it, it flowers, bears fruit, and dies. A watermelon or a cantaloupe is listed as an annual. Squash plant, you plant the seed, it comes up, it grows, produces watermelon or squash, and then it begins to decline, it dies. So, it's completed a life cycle in a single year.
Okay, I'll just use it.
So, right, as we, the second one of those that's listed that we talk about is a biennial. That's another plant definition that we're talking about. And so a biennial, if we're talking about an annual in 1 year, we're talking about a biennial, it's going to complete its life cycle in 2 years. In other words, it will germinate and grow, and then overwinter, and then produce its seeds. And then it will die at the end of the second year. Anybody got an example of a biennial?
What's the definition of it again?
All right, it's a plant that completes its life cycle in 2 years. Germinates and grows a plant. The second year, it will produce a flower or seed and then die.
I want to say there's some type of fruit that does that.
Okay, that's why I'm asking if you had an example of a biennial. A lot of the dandelion type crops will do that too. Produce a plant that will grow, and then in the second year it'll throw a seed pod and produce seeds and die. A lot of those rosette type plants are like that. All right, we talked about an annual, we talked about a biennial. The other category that we talk about is a perennial. So we talked about a 1 year, a 2 year. What's a perennial?
A year.
More than 2. It can be more than 2. A perennial, an example of a perennial would be a rose bush. Most anything that's more of a woody nature. Okay? For examples of perennials. And these are important because of we need to be able to, it affects the type of pest control strategy that we use. Okay? All right, I'll skip through some of these other definitions that we talked about. An appendage is an animal body part or an organ that protects from the main part of the body. So an animal part or organ that protects from the main part of the body. Think of a crawfish. Most of you are familiar with a crawfish or a lobster. The claw on a crawfish or on the lobster is an appendage. Okay? Just as an example.
Would a thorn on a rose bush count as that?
I guess it could in a strange way. It would be but we're talking an appendage. We're talking about an animal part. So a rose bush won't be an animal. Okay. You have a question? Yeah, those are appendages. Yep, exactly. You didn't say, but you did verbalize. That's good. You got your mic on? Tom got your mic on?
I think so, yeah.
All right, good deal. That's fine. Holler at me, because I'm looking at this group, and sometimes I don't look over my shoulder at you all. I guess I should turn on the camera in the back. That way I would be able to see it a little bit. All right, the term control, and I'm just going through the list of stuff that's in the books here. What does control mean? Amanda, did you control your vehicle on the way up here? Okay. But control, the definition here is to kill, prevent, or lessen the harmful effects of, or to destroy, or to repel an undesirable organism.
Is that why every hunting season is called controlling the deer population?
Well, that's a stretch, but yes, that's an attempt to control it. Okay. This summer, in some areas, Japanese beetle were a major problem. And we didn't eradicate them, we attempted to control them. So, the next one of these terms that we talk about is a dicot, D-I-C-O-T. And we're referring to a plant. So a dicot is what? You haven't heard of the term?
Never heard, but I can't remember.
What? What's that?
I've heard it because the plant class says it.
But you didn't retain that information?
Go on to it for a test. And that was it.
Gee, all right, we're talking, dicot is one term we talk about. The other term is a monocot. So di means two, mono means one. So we're talking about as plants begin to grow, a monocot is a plant that has one seed leaf.
How do you spell that?
What? Dicot or monocot?
What do you say? Would it start with a B?
M.
Oh, okay. All right, never mind.
M-O-N-O-C-O-T, monocot.
All right.
Give me an example of a monocot.
I couldn't tell you. I don't know.
Oh, you do. You stepped on it on the way to class.
I know, but I don't remember.
I know. All right, what? You stepped on it as you came out of your house, going to your truck.
Grass.
Grass. That's a monocot. Corn is a monocot. When that seed begins to germinate, it throws up one little seed leaf. Mono means one. So grasses and corn and things like that are monocots.
Okay.
And on the other side of the deal, a dicot means two. So give me an example of a dicot. Bet you ate them for supper sometime this week.
Beans.
Beans. Beans or peas. When that first comes out of the ground, it's got a crooked little leg and it pulls up the two cotyledons, the two little seed leaves. There's two of them. So it's a dicotyledon. Those are two families of plants that we need to be able to recognize to begin to control certain types of things. So, all right, a disease. Any of you had any disease this week? Hope not.
No.
You know what a disease is? It's an abnormal or unhealthy condition caused by an invading organism, such as a bacteria or a virus. So we don't think about disease as much in our daily life as when we were talking about chemical control of things, but the plants that we deal with are subject to disease all the time. I've been spraying grapes like the dickens because of wet conditions that are proliferate disease situations. I'm worried about these grapes rotting in their little bags of sugar water, and it's warm and wet, and they're prone to disease. Which, all right, a gall. You know what a gall is? You see a gall on an oak tree?
Gall like a gallbladder, gall, G-A-L-L?
G-A-L-L. It's not like gallbladder, but it's an abnormal plant growth. Quite often you've seen these big old puffy green things that are on an oak.
They turn black?
They'll turn black, yep. But that's an abnormal plant growth that's caused by the stimuli from an insect or another organism. That little green puffy thing occurs when a particular insect stings that oak leaf, and it begins to grow that gall. It's a reaction to that. So that's just a quick one. What's a host?
It's like something that a parasite or something would feed off of, a host.
Yeah, exactly. An organism infected by a parasite, a plant or animal on which or in which a parasite lives. Hopefully you guys haven't been a host for a critter this summer. I have. I've been
Ticks.
tick. Tyler's right. Right. A tick uses the critter that a tick attaches to is its host, whether it be a dog or a cat or
Children.
human. Children, exactly. So that's what we're talking about with a host.
Well, I was saying children were the pest, but anyway.
Depends. Some people view it that way.
They attach to you, suck the life out of you.
Yeah, they'll do that. It requires some integrated pest management if you're going to do that. That's our next term.
Yes.
So integrated pest management is a system that uses all suitable pest control measures together in a way to keep the pest population below a level that causes economic injury. So in Tom's situation with the children, he has to control them to the point that they don't affect him in an economic manner. Okay? But when we take it to plants, or even animals for that matter, but I'm more familiar with the plant end of it. So, back when we were dealing with apples to a great degree, we always had a problem with mite population, a little red spider type critter that would suck the chlorophyll out of a leaf. And using the idea of an integrated pest management, we would go through the orchard and survey how many, of these critters we'd have on a given leaf. And you could usually tolerate 1 or 2 per leaf. But when you got above a certain level, which is a word we're going to talk about in a minute, a threshold, in other words, say we would tolerate 2, but when we got to 5, that was the threshold that would initiate a chemical action. So as we talk about integrated pest management, it's a system by which we monitor the pest population and keep it below a level that requires a chemical action. We'll talk about IPM a lot more as we move through the semester. Thinking about animals a little bit, what's an invertebrate?
Invertebrate's anything that doesn't have a spine.
Okay. Can you give me an example of an invertebrate?
A snail.
Snail or slug? Worm, yeah, right. Those are invertebrates. They are a category or a population of things that we're concerned about when we're looking at pest situations. All right, this next one is one that's, and I'm going in alphabetical order, not any real relation to what we're talking about in a group, but a juvenile hormone is a natural insect chemical that keeps the early stages of an insect from changing into the normal adult form. And the word itself, if you think about it, juvenile hormone, it's a material, it's a hormone or a chemical substance that prevents the young individuals from reaching their adult stage where they will reproduce. And this is a relatively new concept that the chemical industry has come up with in an attempt to greater use IPM to control levels of pests. Juvenile hormones have come into use, in the last 15 years or so. And they're highly effective, and are quite costly, usually because of the research that's taking place to get them into the use area. But most of them are naturally occurring chemicals or products of natural formations. And for an example, there's one chemical called Delegate that's used to control Lepidoptera, which are moth-type insects. And if it's sprayed on at the time when the insect is just hatched or in the early stages of development, the little larva that will eventually make an adult moth will be affected, and it will not go through its natural progression to make a moth. So in essence, it may eat a little bit, but eventually just die and reduce the overall population. So you've got to have a few of the critters there through the IPM, Integrated Pest Management deal, where you survey the population that you've got before you apply this material. So it's another tool. And all of these things that we talk about with chemical applications are just tools that we use to control these things. And you have to have some knowledge, and that's one of the reasons we talk about pest identification. You got to know what you're finding or what you're seeing to be able to properly do it. And these juvenile hormones are very specific. They are only effective against the particular critter that they're labeled for. So, this Delegate, this material that I'm talking about, is particularly effective against small little worms that will create a moth, which are part of what we call the Lepidoptera family. We'll talk about that some more. That was a juvenile hormone. Metamorphosis. Anybody know what metamorphosis is?
It's when something undergoes a drastic change in its physiology.
You're close, but
Basically, it goes into a cocoon or something, undergoes a change, then pops out.
okay. I'm gonna read you the definition. You're right. It's a change in the body form during the life cycle of an organism. There are two types of metamorphosis: a complete metamorphosis and a gradual metamorphosis. All right, can you give me an example of something that you are familiar with that goes through a metamorphosis?
Butterfly.
Butterfly is a good example. Yep. Any of you guys ever played with the old wasp, the little wasp nest that you'll find in the end of under the barn shelter?
No, I run away from it. No, I don't play with
You what?
I said I run the opposite direction. I don't play with water.
All right. Rachel has. She's knocked them down. Never had. All right, that'll give you a good visual of metamorphosis if you've ever taken one of those down that's, size 50 cents or larger. You'll kill the wasps that are on it. But if you'll take that nest down and begin to pull it apart, you'll see some of those cells will have a little egg in it. And you move a little closer into the middle, and that cell will have a little worm type looking thing, and then the next little cell will have a little white structure that looks a lot like a wasp. And then you go a little farther into the center. And the reason I'm going into the center, those cells in the center were the first ones that the wasp put in there. And so you pull the cap off of that next one, and you may actually see a grown or mature wasp. And this is an example of metamorphosis as it changes from different stages through its growth year's life cycle. A cicada, you're familiar with the 17-year locust or a cicada?
Yeah.
Are you have any knowledge of the metamorphosis of a cicada, what they do, what their life cycle is like?
Don't they leave their skin on the tree, don't they like shed a different skin or something like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, that's the last phase of their metamorphosis. That critter that left its skin or shell on the tree emerged as an adult, and it flew away. And you've got two different sexes of those. You've got a male and a female. And during the years when you have locusts or cicada, and we have a few of those every year, but normally we have a 17-year cycle of those things. And during that 17th year, their populations are enormous. But when they emerge, you've got the male and the female. And they'll go up into the trees, and on warm days, you'll hear them make just a buzzing sound. They're just a real noisy thing. And that's a mating call for them. They're attracted to one another. One of them, and I can't remember which, makes all the noise, the other one goes to it. And then you'll see them, if you observe it, you'll see them mate. And then the female of that will go to a young, tender twig about the size of a pencil. And that female will sit on that little twig, and she'll actually split it. She has a part of her anatomy called an ovipositor, and it's sharp, and it'll put about a half-inch slit in that little green twig. When we grew apple trees, it was horrible because they would split those apple trees, and most of the time there'd be enough of them to cause that limb to die. But she'll make a whole little row of that young twig, and that as she makes that split, she will deposit a little elongated white egg in that slit. And that'll stay in there for about 3 to 4 weeks, depending upon temperature, and then it'll hatch and drop to the ground. So we've got one stage of the metamorphosis there with the egg going to a little larva. And that little larva will burrow down in the ground, and it will find the root of that particular tree that the mature one made that ova deposit on. Ova is an egg deposited there. The small little larva goes down, and it will feed on the roots of that plant for about 16 years. It goes through several different stages of metamorphosis, changing and getting bigger and bigger, until during that 17th year, it will emerge with that brown, ugly hole-looking thing, and it'll crawl up on a tree, and that hole will split, and you've got another generation of the cicada. So that's just another example of the type of changes that we're talking about with the metamorphosis. Another term, as we talk about pest management, that we're concerned with is the mode of action. And that's a phrase, but what would mode of action be? What does it sound like?
Mode of action, it sounds like the method in which something performs an action.
Yeah, you're right. It's how a pesticide works, or the way it controls a pest. So if we're using a chemical that poisons a pest, you need to find a time in its life cycle when it is where the pesticide will act upon it. Taking just a real simplified example of a mode of action, what would be the mode of action of a mousetrap?
Spring action.
Yeah, just a spring action that flaps and kill it. That's the mode of action, just how simple that can be. Some of the mode of actions of chemical pesticides are to actually poison the insect. We were talking about the juvenile hormone. The mode of action there would be to alter the metamorphosis or the development of the latter stages of the life cycle. So depends upon what we're talking about as to what the mode of action of that material would be. But they vary. That's one of the things that we deal with. If we're talking about fungicides, fungicides are materials that control fungus on different plants or things. So quite often the mode of action for fungicide is protective. In other words, you put a coating of a particular material on a plant to protect it from the entrance of disease. All right. Next term we're looking at is a mollusk. What's a mollusk?
Clams.
Okay. It's a soft-bodied invertebrate animal, usually protected by a shell. So Tyler's right. A clam, a snail, or a slug are often mollusks, or called mollusks. The term monitoring.
Watching something?
Yeah. That's quite often monitoring is the term that we use now is referring to integrated pest management. It's determining the size and distribution of a pest population in an area. It's also called scouting. Those terms are used interchangeably. But for you to be able to have a knowledge of the pests that exist, whether it be on your roses or your potatoes or your beans or your cabbage or cucumbers or your horse, you need to know what type of pests might be there. So, monitoring is nothing more than looking at it, watching. And if you've got a large acreage of corn, you're concerned about corn earworms in there, you'll walk through the corn and see if you see any evidence of the corn earworm coming. If you've got cabbage, you're worried about cabbage loopers, cabbage worms, you have to go through and look or scout and evaluate how many of the little yellow butterflies that exist. That's another example of a metamorphosis we'll talk about later. So, what about a nematode? Anybody got any nematodes? Take your shoes off if you got any nematodes.
I've heard that phrase before, but I do not recall what it means.
You got any nematodes?
I don't know what to say.
Tyler recognized I was picking on him that time. But a nematode is a microscopic eel-like roundworm. It's a little bitty, they're soil worms that affect the root systems of a lot of crops. A lot of times we're not aware that they're there. They're microscopic, and you can't see them with the naked eye. And they are more prevalent in areas where land has been cropped on a yearly basis. That can be a tremendous detriment to excuse me, to various crops. There was a time several years ago that they were concerned about nematodes affecting the root system of peach trees because they would spread viruses. Nematodes are a problem in certain types of tobacco, cotton, soybeans, particularly those types of crops. And if you're having a problem with the vigor or the growth rate on some of these field crops, and you don't see anything in the top of the aerial portion of the plant, your next action normally is to take a soil sample or an assay, as they talk about, and send it to a lab to have the populations of the nematodes evaluated. Tech does a nematode assay for some things. You just have to send them a soil sample. And they'll give you a reading on if they were there and how many of them were there. But it's a microscopic eel-like roundworm. And if you have nematodes, it's a real problem to deal with them. Usually you have to go through a crop rotation to eliminate their host so that they don't continue to grow and multiply. The other alternative is to spray or do something with a nematicide. And a nematicide, it's nematode material. It's an insecticide that's specifically destined to control nematodes. So those are usually soil injected. It's cumbersome to do. Most of those materials are highly toxic, and it's real expensive to do those. Non-target is a term that you need to at least be familiar with as we talk about this. What would we mean by non-target?
I'm guessing it's something that doesn't target something specifically, it just blankets it.
Well, you're swinging at it, just close. Non-target is any site or organism other than the site or pest toward which the control measure is being directed. So if we're talking about Japanese beetle, that would be the target. But if there happened to be some hornets or wasp in the same area, the hornet or wasp would be the non-target organism. The Jap beetle would be the target organism. The term organism is the next one. That's any living thing, which would mean either an animal, a plant, fungi, or a bacteria. They are all organisms. They're living things. And we deal with organisms throughout the entire concept and application or pesticide application. All right, we talked about parasite. We've already given that one. What is a pathogen? This is one that you've heard, but you may not use every day.
Any infectious disease?
You defined it, you qualified it too much.
Disease.
Any organism that causes disease in other organisms is the definition of pathogen.
I'm guessing then something like bacteria would fall into that.
Yeah, most of those would be a pathogen. Along those same lines, what's a pest?
Anything that causes damage to crops or is generally annoying.
Well, you're swinging at it again. Any living thing that is undesirable or harms people, property, or the environment. Now, I'm sure that all of you all deal with pests. I'm going to ask you to give me an example of a pest.
Ants.
Tyler's saying ants. What about you guys at Southside? Give me an example of a pest for each of you.
Please.
Please, okay.
Bagworms.
What was that? I heard worms, but what?
Bagworms.
Yeah, bagworms. Yes. Yep. Amanda, a pest.
Her ex-boyfriend.
I didn't hear that one. What was that?
I said her ex-boyfriend.
She just said people. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's true. That meets the definition. Okay? Again. Rachel, what's a pest?
There's a lot.
I know. What? Did you say instructors?
Don't make me come over there.
No. In your situation, a horsefly
Yeah.
would be a pest. She spends a lot of her time on a horse, and a horsefly can create an issue with you.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but that's what I'm trying to do is create an idea for all of you about the diversity of what that term means. Okay, the wasp that we were talking about is a pest. A mosquito's a pest.
Deer are.
Tyler says deer are a pest. Yeah, that's true.
Yes, they are.
Groundhogs, they're a pest.
It tastes good.
So, that's all we're talking about. All right, the next one in the list here is a pheromone. Now, you may or may not know what a pheromone is, but I want you to understand what a pheromone is.
Pheromones are hormonal chemicals given off by something that incites a reaction with other organisms.
All right, you're close. Anybody else got a definition of a pheromone?
No.
Alternatively, they could be relaying information.
Well, pheromones in the idea of chemical application has really grown in the last number of years. But the definition is chemicals emitted by an organism to influence the behavior of other organisms of the same species. Okay? So, Tyler mentioned deer. Deer being a pest. But as deer begin their mating operations, the female will emit pheromones, aromas that will affect the behavior of the male deer. That's a pheromone. If we take it to insects, a lot of the chemical manufacturers in the past number of years have been working with what we call pheromones that will interrupt the mating processes of different insects. Well, there's one, we've got a pest with grape production called a grape-bearing moth. And it's a little bitty microscopic little moth of a thing that, if left unimpeded, it will mate, and the female will sit down on a grape and deposit an egg. And that egg, when it hatches, it's a little bitty small round structure. Instead of it hatching and coming to the outside where it would be so that you could spray a chemical on and kill it, it doesn't come that way. The little rascal, when it hatches, it goes into the grape. So you've got a little bitty larval organism that feeds on the interior portion of the grape. You never have an opportunity to kill it with chemicals because you can't spray something systemic that will get into the plant system and kill that, because you don't want that poison inside the system of the grape. So, the grape-bearing moth, through its physiology, has a very safe system developed what the chemical companies are trying to do is create a pheromone that interrupts the mating system of the grape-bearing moth. So when this female is flying around looking for a male, and you sprayed this pheromone in the vineyard, it doesn't know where to go. It gets all confused because everywhere smells like a male moth. So this pheromone application is a biological or another mechanism with integrated pest management where it confuses that population of critters, so it doesn't mate. So pheromones are very unique. They're extremely hard to do research on because of we can't identify the pheromone. We can't smell them. They don't smell good to us or stink to us or whatever. So it's a chemical that's emitted by an organism to influence the behavior of other organisms of the same species. So that's what we're doing. The term that is used as we talk about chemical control is a term called predator. What's a predator?
A predator.
Yeah.
Something that hunts for its food.
Yeah, that's right. A predator is an animal that attacks, kills, and feeds on other animals. We didn't used to have coyotes in our community. Coyote is a predator. It attacks, kills, and eats other animals. Foxes are predators. Raccoons are predators to a point.
Generally, if it has sharp teeth and claws, it's a predator.
Not necessarily. A groundhog's not a predator on another animal. But a groundhog fits the definition you just used.
It can be if it needs to be.
What's that?
Do what?
What'd you say?
You said a bear is not normally a predator, but it can be if it needs to.
Oh, yeah, a bear can be a predator, yeah. We were talking about a groundhog not being a predator. But anyway, you all understand what I mean by predator. The term resistance.
Something's resistance to a chemical.
You can't use the word to define itself.
The inability of
Withstanding.
Chemical, when we go through ideas of chemical applications of things, resistance management is one of the things that we're really dealing with now. And resistance is the natural or genetic ability of an organism to tolerate the toxic effects of a pest attack. So resistance is something that, assume we're dealing with powdery mildew on grapes. Resistance, say we're using a particular chemical, Thompson N, for example, to curtail the amount of powdery mildew on grapes. So we apply Thompson N this week, and it kills 90% of the powdery mildew, but 10% of it survives. So next week, we've still got powdery mildew because that 10% that was there has regrown and it's multiplied. So if we spray Thompson M again, we're going to be spraying it against a population that was resistant to it the first time. So it's an inability of a chemical or something to affect that disease that we're talking about. And resistance management is something that is one of the things that's really come to the forefront as we talk about chemical applications. So, all right, we talked about scouting and monitoring. They're the same thing. It's regularly searching for and identifying and assessing the numbers of pest damage. Threshold, we mentioned it a little bit, but threshold is the pest population level that requires an action to prevent unacceptable injury. And I gave you the one with mites as a threshold. Mites are hard to see, but if we use Japanese beetle on your rose bushes that you've got in the yard, if you go through there today and you see 2 Japanese beetle, you think, well, they're not going to hurt you. That's not going to be a big problem. But if you go through there on Saturday and you see 15 Japanese beetles, they have exceeded the threshold. In other words, that threshold is the point at which action needs to be taken to prevent the harm that they're talking about. All right, we talked about an invertebrate. What is a vertebrate?
anything with a spine.
Any animal with a backbone, example of a mammal, a bird, or a reptile. Yep. This next one is always an interesting one when we bring it up. What's a weed?
Something you don't want grown somewhere.
Okay.
An undesirable plant that invades ecosystems.
Okay. Both of those examples are acceptable. Rachel, what's a weed?
Could be anything.
Could be anything. The simplest definition of that is a plant growing out of place. So, soybean plant is nice, it's desirable, but if it's growing in a cornfield, it's a weed. Okay? Same thing, if it's a corn plant growing in a soybean field, it's a weed. If it's a thistle growing in a pasture, it's a weed. So anything where it's not wanted is a definition of a weed. And all these terms that we're talking about here are things that we need to be aware of as we talk about the idea of pest control.
So could the clover invading my backyard be considered a weed?
Absolutely. Clover in a fescue lawn is a weed. It is. Yeah. Oxalis is a weed in the yard. You know, it just that's just basic definition. But it makes a difference. We need to be able to recognize these terms as we move forward, trying to determine how we're going to evaluate the control of various pests. Because we need to be able to identify what the pest is. I've had several folks come to me lately, or back in the summer, with holes in their squash plants. In their things on the flowers, petunias are big. I don't see anything on my that's eating them. What's making the holes in them? And quite often, what was doing it was a slug or a snail doing it at night, because they'll stay in the leaf litter and in the trash and so forth, you know, in the flower bed. But when it gets dark at night, they'll crawl up and they'll eat holes out of a squash plant or a petunia plant. And then when it gets daylight, they'll go back down. You can't tell what it is. So, you know, we have to use this monitoring or scouting to be able to determine this. Just if you had that situation and you didn't want to go out there every night with a flashlight looking to see if you could find snails, what would be a mechanism that you could use to determine if you had snails?
Camera?
Yeah, it would be mighty sophisticated. I'm talking about something a whole lot simpler than that.
Put some glue on the top of the leaf.
Well, that would damage your plant. Glue's toxic. Rachel knows what I'm talking about, I bet you. She's smiling. You guys at Southside probably know how to do this. All right, I'm going to share it. Take a small saucer or the lid from a mayonnaise jar and fill it about half full of beer and set it out there.
What?
You do what?
What?
Has blue ribbon.
Bush Light.
I still didn't hear what you said.
I was asking what?
Beer in a jar lid. What happens? The slugs are attracted by the aroma or the smell of that beer. They'll crawl over in there and die. That's the simplest way to monitor the population that you've got in those situations. Real easy way to determine whether they're there. Guys growing strawberries have a real problem with slugs and snails, because most of the strawberries now are grown on black plastic, and it's the little hole where the strawberry plant is planted through. Snails get underneath that plastic and they'll crawl out and eat strawberry leaves. Eat strawberries actually as they're growing, and then they'll crawl back in there at night during the day. So it's a real problem dealing with those. So that's just an example. Rather than go into, let's see, let me see where we go. We talked about what a pest is. The identification of a pest, you know, the example I gave you with the slugs and so forth feeding on the petunias, is a mechanism of identifying. You couldn't find it any other way, so you used a trap type situation with the beer in the jar lid to identify them. The different types of pests that we deal with are weeds, parasites and diseases, mollusks, arthropods, and vertebrates. Now, arthropods are insects or their relatives. They are just examples of what we're talking about. I'm going to probably, I've talked about an hour and I'm about to get squeaky. So, any questions about what we've talked about today? This is sort of building a foundation for what we're going to talk about with this pest control. This is not a real long chapter, but what it does is it builds this foundation for us to move forward into the rest of stuff. We've got 2 videos that we'll look at next week and give you an idea of what Virginia Tech wants to emphasize with controlling this. But we'll talk a little bit about prevention. These are the 3 types of control we talk about: prevention, suppression, and eradication. But prevention is minimizing the chances that a pest will cause a problem. In most horticultural situations, we use the idea of prevention. In other words, we'll use some chemicals to prevent the incidence of disease or insect populations. We also do with suppression by reducing the number of pests that are there. And eradication is in destroying. I told you to get squished. Destroying the entire pest population. So those are the goals that we'll use. I'm gonna let you guys go. I've about shot. We'll talk about some integrated pest management techniques and look at this pest control video when we get back together on Monday. Okay.